Elena Valdez was 68 years old when she understood, in the cruelest and most precise way possible, that an entire life could crumble without a fuss. She had been a woman of serene beauty, the kind that draws attention not through excess, but through presence. Silver hair carefully styled to her shoulders, a straight back, slender hands with long fingers, and a restrained elegance that seemed born from the habit of carrying everything on her own without asking for help. That autumn, when it all happened, she had been married for more than 4 decades to Arturo Valdez, a prestigious, methodical lawyer, much older than her, a man with a soft voice and dark suits who inspired respect, even when he said nothing. Elena had entered that family while still very young, with an almost naive faith in the idea that love, loyalty and time would eventually create a place for a woman in any home. For 40 years, she had been an impeccable hostess, a proper wife, a silent presence at important dinners, and an almost invisible figure at gatherings where Arturo's children treated her as if she were a well-preserved piece of furniture. From the outside, her life seemed orderly. From the inside, it was a long-standing habit of giving up space. The morning of the reading of the will dawned grey, with a fine drizzle clinging to the windows as if the day itself were avoiding confronting what was about to happen. Eleanor left home in a muted burgundy outfit, an antique brooch on her lapel, and with that almost mechanical care of someone who still believes dignity can protect her from something. Arturo's children were already in the notary's office, polished, well-dressed, with that unbearable air of inherited self-assurance that some people possess even before receiving anything. The eldest daughter, Beatrice, wore a dry, expensive perfume that filled the air more than her own voice. The youngest son, Esteban, kept glancing at his watch as if the whole thing were a bothersome formality. Elena sat at the end of the table, back straight, hands on her purse, unaware that she was about to hear the words that would split her life in two. She wasn't expecting jewels, a spectacular fortune, or a belated romantic gesture. She was expecting something much simpler and more human. Security. The house where she had lived. A semblance of stability. Some concrete sign that she hadn't dedicated 40 years of her life to an elegant fiction. But when the document began to be read and all the accounts, properties and investments were assigned to the children, the atmosphere in the room changed. And when her name was finally mentioned, it wasn't as his wife, nor as his life partner, but with a legalistic coldness that drained the life from her face, a humiliating reference to the domestic and companionship services she had rendered during their marriage. All Arturo was leaving her was an old house in an unfamiliar city, far from everything, as if her entire existence could fit there, in a secondary role on the margins of someone else's fortune. The silence that followed the reading wasn't immediate. It was slow, thick, as if the air in the room had suddenly grown denser. Eleanor didn't cry. That was the first thing they noticed, though no one said it aloud. There was no outburst, no questions, no pleading, only a slight hardening of her posture, as if her body were trying to hold on to something that no longer had a form. Beatrice exchanged a quick glance with her brother, one of those glances that carry years of complicity and silent contempt. For them, this wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. For decades, they had treated Elena as someone temporary, someone occupying a place that didn't quite belong to her. And now the legal document, cold and definitive, seemed to prove them right. The notary cleared his throat uncomfortably, as if he sensed something indecent in the way that life was being summarized. But he continued reading. Clauses, numbers, locations. Elena barely heard. His mind had become trapped in that phrase, repeating itself with cruel precision, like a label that could not be torn off. When the meeting ended, no one approached her. There was no comfort, no gesture, not even basic courtesy. Esteban was the first to stand, impatiently adjusting his jacket, while Beatrice gathered her purse with elegant and precise movements. Elena remained seated for a few more seconds, as if she needed to check that the ground was still firm beneath her feet. It was then that Beatrice, now standing, said something that wasn't in any document, but which definitively shaped the scene. With a brief, almost friendly smile, She remarked that she hoped Elena wouldn't delay in vacating the main house, because there were matters to be settled. It wasn't a direct order, but it didn't need to be. Elena nodded gently, without arguing, without looking up. And that small, almost imperceptible gesture was what reassured them. Most, because it confirmed what they had always believed, that she wasn't going to resist, that she was going to disappear with the same discretion with which she had lived. But what no one in that room was able to perceive, not even for a second, was that something inside Elena wasn't exactly breaking, it was changing places. Elena returned to the house that same afternoon, not like someone coming home, but like someone walking through a place that no longer belonged to her for the last time. Every object seemed to have a different weight, as if suddenly everything was laden with a history she could no longer bear. The china she had polished for years, the paintings she never chose, the furniture that always seemed too big for her. Everything was there untouched, but it no longer had any meaning. She walked slowly through the hallways, touching surfaces with her fingertips, as if she needed to say goodbye without making a sound. In the master bedroom, where she had slept for decades, next to a man she never truly knew, she lingered longer. She looked at the perfectly tidy wardrobe with Arturo's clothes still hanging as if he might return at any moment. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than pain. It wasn't anger yet, nor was it pure sadness. It was a kind of lucid emptiness, as if she were finally seeing her own life from the outside, without justifying anything. That night, she didn't turn on the television, didn't call anyone, didn't seek explanations. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that grew cold without her touching it, and let the silence do its work. It was there, in that uncomfortable stillness, that she began to remember things she had ignored for years. Small details, almost insignificant at the time, but which now returned with a disturbing clarity. Arturo's frequent absences, always justified by work. The calls he answered in hushed tones, far from any ear. The trips he never spoke much about. And above all, that constant feeling that there were parts of his life to which Elena had never had access. For decades, she had interpreted that as emotional distance, as a limitation of his character, never as a secret. But now, with the will still echoing in her head, that idea began to shift, and for the first time the unfamiliar house she had inherited stopped seeming like a punishment and began to feel like a question. 2 days later, with a discreet suitcase and the same quiet care that had marked her entire life, Elena closed the door of the main house without looking back. There was no goodbye, no ceremony, only the dry click of the lock and a strange feeling of lightness that passed through her chest for a second, as if something inside her had been released without permission. The journey to the unfamiliar city was long, along roads that seemed to stretch longer than usual, with landscapes that changed slowly, as if the world too was taking its time to let her go. Elena drove with both. Hands firmly on the wheel, her face calm, but with an unusual attention to every detail. She had spent too many years following paths that others chose for her. This time, even if she didn't fully understand where she was going, at least the movement was hers. And at some point during the journey, as the sun began to set and the light turned golden over the fields, she thought something she hadn't allowed herself to think in decades. Perhaps she wasn't losing everything. Perhaps she was emerging from something. The city appeared without grand announcement, as places that don't expect to be seen often do. Wide streets, ancient trees, wooden facades that bore the marks of time without shame. It wasn't an abandoned place, as she had imagined, nor was it luxurious. It was lived in. When she finally found the address, the car stopped in front of a property that left her motionless for a few seconds. It wasn't a forgotten house. It was a large, old-style building with a wide veranda, tall. Windows and a garden tended with almost affectionate precision. Vines climbed the walls, as if they had been patiently guided for years. And the most disconcerting thing wasn't the house itself, but the immediate feeling that this place wasn't foreign to her. She got out of the car slowly, feeling the crunch of gravel under her shoes, and before she could even touch the door, someone called her name, not with hesitation, not with surprise, but with a familiarity that defied explanation. And at that moment, something inside Elena tensed, not from fear but from recognition. The woman who had called her stood on the other side of the garden, wearing a light-colored apron and her hair pulled back in a loose bun, strands of silver escaping. She possessed a quiet beauty, timeless, and a steady gaze that seemed utterly unsurprised. She walked confidently toward Elena, wiping her hands on the apron, and before Elena could utter a word, she was standing before her, smiling with a disarming warmth. She said her name again, Elena Valdez, as if confirming something she had always known, and then added that they had been expecting her. That sentence hung between them for a second longer than usual. Elena felt a slight dizziness, as if the ground had shifted without warning. She couldn't understand how anyone in that city could know who she was, much less that they had been expecting her. But the strangest thing wasn't the information itself, but the naturalness with which it was delivered, as if it were all part of a long-established order. The woman introduced herself as Teresa, the caretaker of the property, and spoke of the house as if Eleanor had always been its rightful owner. As they walked together toward the entrance, Teresa pointed out details with intimate familiarity. The garden that had been redesigned a few years ago, the restored porch, the windows reinforced before the last winter. Elena listened silently, trying to piece together a logical explanation for it all, but each step she took inside seemed to distance her further from any simple idea. The interior was immaculate, not with the cold order of a closed house, but with the subtle life of a place inhabited with intention. There were fresh flowers on the table, open curtains letting in the afternoon light, and a soft aroma of wood and something else, something vaguely familiar. It was then that Teresa mentioned, almost as if stating the obvious, that Arturo had spent many years coming there. Not as an occasional visitor, but frequently, with dedication, with a kind of presence that cannot be improvised. And at that moment, Eleanor felt all the pieces she had ignored for years begin to move for the first time. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She stood in the middle of the room, her gaze scanning every corner as if trying to find a crack in that reality, because it wasn't just the information that unsettled her, it was the feeling. There was something in the atmosphere that wasn't new to her, even though she couldn't explain it. A painting hung slightly tilted, a wooden table with subtle marks on the edge, a lamp with a warm light that seemed placed exactly where it should be. They weren't extraordinary objects, but together they created a harmony that didn't feel improvised. And then, almost without realizing it, Elena moved toward a side corridor, guided more by intuition than curiosity. Teresa didn't stop her. She just watched her silently, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Elena's heart began to beat faster when she reached a half-open door at the end of the corridor. She hesitated for a second before pushing it open, but something inside her, something that had been dormant for years, no longer wanted to back down. The room was different from the rest of the house, not from neglect, but by design. It was a carefully preserved space, as if it had been designed to hold more than just furniture. There were shelves full of labeled boxes, a large table with documents organized with almost obsessive precision, and on one of the walls a collection of framed photographs. Eleanor approached slowly, feeling a lump form in her throat even before she looked closely, and when she finally did, time seemed to stand still in an unsettling way, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. Because in those photographs there were no official family gatherings, no social events, no public scenes. They were private moments, intimate. Eleanor appeared in them, without knowing it, smiling as she arranged flowers on the table in the old house, reading in the garden on an ordinary afternoon, even asleep on the sofa in the soft light of night. Images captured over the years, in moments she never knew someone was observing with such attention, and the most disconcerting thing was not that Arturo had been present at those moments. It was that somehow he had been watching in a way that she had never perceived. It was in that same room, still breathing, ragged and with her hands slightly trembling, that Elena noticed something else. It wasn't just a collection of memories. There was a pattern. The photographs weren't placed randomly. They followed a kind of silent timeline, as if someone had tried to piece together a complete story from seemingly insignificant fragments. And in the center of that wall, slightly separated from the rest, was a different, larger frame with thicker glass. Inside wasn't a picture, but a sealed envelope made of aged paper, with his name handwritten on it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elena felt a sudden heat rise in her chest, a mixture of anxiety, disbelief, and something she didn't dare name. For decades, Arturo had been a man of measured words, almost always distant. And now, in that hidden space, he seemed to have left something direct, personal, something that hadn't gone through lawyers or cold documents. Elena hesitated before touching the envelope. It was as if opening it would shatter the last version she had of her own life. At that moment, as she held the unopened envelope, something inside her shifted again. It wasn't a sudden transformation, nor a complete revelation. It was more subtle, deeper. For the first time since reading the will, Elena didn't just feel hurt. She felt involved in something she didn't yet fully understand. It was as if the story she'd been told about her own life was incomplete, and she had just found a part that had been deliberately hidden. And if you've followed every detail, perhaps you can feel exactly that same unsettling doubt that began to grow within her, that feeling that there's something greater behind what seems obvious. Elena took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and finally broke the seal on the envelope, knowing that from that moment on there was no way to reinterpret the past in the same way. Inside the envelope were several handwritten pages, the ink neither fresh nor old or worn. Elena immediately recognized Arturo's firm handwriting, that precise style that seemed to allow no room for error. The first line wasn't formal, not legalistic, nothing like the distant man she had known for 40 years. It was direct, intimate, and, in some strange way, vulnerable. Arturo didn't begin by explaining decisions. He began by asking for forgiveness, not grandiloquently, but almost restrainedly, as if he knew no words would suffice, yet still needed to try. As Elena continued reading, her body remained still. But inside, something was reorganizing itself with a quiet intensity. Arturo spoke of family, of children, of how he had learned too late that affection doesn't always build loyalty. He explained with a painful clarity that he had spent years watching how they treated her, how they ignored her, how they reduced her presence to a useful function. And the most disconcerting thing wasn't the information. It was knowing that he had always seen all of that. Halfway through the letter, the tone shifted. It was no longer just a confession, but a strategic explanation. Arturo revealed that the official will wasn't what it seemed, that he had made the conscious decision to leave his visible wealth to his children, the wealth that would inevitably be disputed, challenged, and fragmented over time. Meanwhile, the property where Elena stood, along with a network of carefully protected assets, had been designed to remain beyond any legal reach. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan. Every document in that room, every detail in the house, every connection forged in that city was part of something he had prepared for years, not to punish them, but to set her free. And at that point in the reading, Elena stopped feeling cold. Because for the first time, amidst all that emotional turmoil, an idea she hadn't considered emerged. That perhaps she hadn't been discarded, that she had been protected in a way she never recognized. The last pages of the letter weren't long, but they carried a weight that Elena felt almost physically in her chest. Arturo spoke of something he had never been able to express in life, his inability to face his children directly, his fear of causing an open rupture that would end up destroying everything prematurely. He admitted that his way of loving had been flawed, indirect, even cowardly at times. But he also made it clear that he had observed Elena for years with a silent, almost obsessive attention, recognizing in her a strength that was never publicly acknowledged. He said that he couldn't change the past, nor the way he had left her alone in many situations, but that he could at least ensure that the end of that story didn't leave her unprotected. He had patiently and precisely built a space where she wouldn't have to ask permission to exist. And what was most disturbing for Elena wasn't reading those words. It was realizing that, on some level, she had always felt that gaze upon her, even if she had never known how to interpret it. Elena slowly lowered the sheets, sensing how the silence of the house was no longer the same as before. It wasn't empty. It was contained. As if each wall held a piece of a story she was only just beginning to understand. She walked around the room again, but now with a different perception, a different posture. She was no longer an intruder discovering something foreign. She was someone beginning to occupy a space that, in some way, had always belonged to her. It was then that Teresa appeared in the doorway, observing her with a mixture of respect and something harder to define. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Elena held the woman's gaze for a moment, and in that silent exchange there was an immediate understanding, as if they both knew that something had changed irreversibly. Outside, the wind gently stirred the leaves in the garden, and for the first time since Arturo's death, Elena didn't feel absence. She felt direction. That same afternoon, Teresa showed her the rest of the property with almost ceremonial care, as if each space held a meaning that had to be understood little by little. Some rooms looked recently used, others had a more aged feel, but none were abandoned. On the ground floor, behind an inconspicuous door that went unnoticed unless you knew where to look, was a smaller office, different from the one Elena had already seen. There, the documents weren't just organized like files, they were classified with strategic intent. Folders, with dates, names, financial records, correspondence, even copies of contracts that didn't visibly bear the Valdez surname. Elena began to leaf through some of those papers, feeling how each line brought her closer to a more complex truth. It wasn't just a hidden inheritance, it was a complete structure, designed to stand on its own, far from the reach of anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. And at that moment, something in her thinking shifted again. Arturo hadn't improvised anything. He had anticipated scenarios, conflicts, even the reactions of his own children. It wasn't long before that anticipated scenario began to unfold. 2 days after their arrival, the house phone rang for the first time. Elena hesitated before answering, but when she did, the voice on the other end left no room for misinterpretation. It was Esteban. His tone no longer held the casual impatience of before. Now there was a contained tension, a poorly disguised urgency. He spoke directly, without beating around the bush, asking about the property, the documents, any detail that might confirm what they already suspected. There was no greeting, no politeness, only interest. Elena listened in silence, holding the receiver firmly, feeling something new settle inside her with every word he spoke. When he finally answered, his voice was calm, almost soft, but with a certainty she had never before displayed in front of him. He denied nothing, but neither did he offer any information. He simply made it clear with a precision that surprised even herself that that part of the story no longer belonged to them. And when he hung up, she didn't feel fear. She felt in control. The following days were strangely clear, as if after years of living in a kind of emotional fog, Elena could finally see the contours of her own life with clarity. There was no rush, but neither was there confusion. She began to review each document patiently, without anxiety, gradually grasping the true scope of what Arturo had built. It wasn't just money nor hidden properties, it was independence, There were protected accounts, investments distributed almost invisibly, legal agreements that shielded the property from any external attempt at appropriation. There was even correspondence with lawyers in other cities, people who had never had contact with the official family. Everything was designed for a single purpose, that Elena wouldn't depend on anyone. And the more she delved into this understanding, the more she realized something she found uncomfortable to admit. She had never lived with this level of autonomy. For 40 years, her security had been an illusion sustained by someone else. Now, for the first time, she had something that couldn't be taken away with someone else's signature. But that same clarity also brought with it an inevitable decision. Elena knew that Arturo's children weren't going to accept this silently, not after having grown up believing that everything belonged to them, by natural right. And they soon confirmed it. A week later, the formal notification arrived. They were initiating legal proceedings to dispute the property. The argument was predictable. They questioned the validity of the documents, insinuated manipulation, even suggested that Elena wasn't in a position to manage assets of that magnitude. None of that surprised her. What did make her pause for a moment was the coldness with which everything was written, as if she were an administrative obstacle, and not someone who had shared their father's life for decades. And yet, instead of feeling the weight of that threat, Elena experienced something different. If you are accompanying this story here, perhaps you already perceive that silent change, that force that does not make noise but alters everything inside. Because in that instant, she understood that she was no longer in the same position as before. I wasn't going to react out of fear. I was going to respond from knowledge. Elena didn't. Seek a lawyer immediately. Not out of naivete, but because she no longer reacted the way she used to. First, she sat for an entire afternoon in the small home office, all the documents laid out before her, organizing them with almost methodical calm. She wasn't the same woman who had listened to that will without reacting. There was something new in her way of thinking, a clarity that didn't come from legal experience, but from understanding her own place in that story. She read clauses, compared dates, reviewed signatures. She discovered details that at another point in her life would have gone completely unnoticed, and little by little, what had seemed an inevitable conflict began to transform into a manageable situation. Because Arturo hadn't just protected the property, he had anticipated precisely this type of attack. He had left implicit instructions, legal avenues, even the names of professionals who would know how to proceed without exposing anything unnecessary. Elena wasn't improvising. She was following a map that had been waiting years to be used. When she finally responded to the legal notice, it wasn't with the desperate defense her associates had expected. She responded with precision. Through a lawyer recommended in one of the documents, she sent a firm, clear reply, backed by evidence they hadn't known existed. But the most decisive element wasn't the formal response. It was what came next. Elena requested a direct meeting, not in court, not in impersonal offices, but in the very house where it had all been built. When Beatriz and Esteban arrived, they did so with the same confidence they had always possessed, although now there was a palpable tension in their movements. They found her sitting on the veranda, the afternoon light illuminating her silver hair, her posture upright, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't get up to greet them. She didn't need to. And in that instant, without anyone saying it aloud, one thing became clear. The woman they had tried to dismiss was no longer in the same position, and this time she wasn't going to disappear quietly. The silence in the gallery wasn't awkward. It was strategic. Elena observed them unhurriedly, as if she were gauging something more than their words. Beatriz was the first to speak, with that firm tone she always used to create distance, but this time there was a slight crack in her confidence. She began by mentioning the legal process, the doubts about the validity of the inheritance, trying to regain control of the conversation from a technical standpoint. Esteban, on the other hand, remained more tense, his arms crossed, looking around as if searching for something to confirm his suspicions. Elena listened to everything without interrupting, without justifying, without reacting emotionally. When she finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize anything. She simply placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of documents they hadn't seen before, records, agreements, sensitive information that, if made public, would not only invalidate their claims, but would put much more at risk than they were willing to lose. It wasn't an explicit threat. It was a reality presented calmly. The conversation shifted in tone in a matter of seconds. It was no longer about claiming an inheritance. It was about understanding how far they were willing to go. Elena didn't ask for anything. She didn't negotiate from a place of need. She simply made it clear that the property, the structure, and everything that came with it was not up for discussion, and that any attempt to pursue legal action would trigger consequences they hadn't foreseen. There was a long, awkward silence, where for the first time in decades Beatriz didn't have an immediate response. Esteban looked away, his jaw clenched, processing something he clearly hadn't expected to face. And in that instant, without shouting, without direct confrontation, without needing to impose her will, Elena won. Not because she had more power in traditional terms, but because she was no longer playing the same game. They had come expecting to find the same woman they could pressure. But that woman was no longer there. After that meeting, there were no more aggressive calls, no more legal notices, no more attempts at contact disguised as cordiality. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of a clear boundary. Elena didn't celebrate this victory visibly. She wasn't that kind of person. But inside her something finally settled. Not as a triumph over others, but as a personal affirmation. For years, she had lived reacting, adapting, occupying whatever space was left for her. Now, for the first time, she was defining her own place without asking permission. She began to walk through the house differently, to sit in the spaces without that feeling of transience that had always accompanied her. She was no longer just passing through. She wasn't waiting to be accepted. She was living. Over time, the house ceased to feel like a mystery and began to feel like home. Elena got to know the people of the village, discovering their stories, sharing small routines that had nothing to do with the life she had led before. The community didn't look at her with judgment or expectation. They treated her as someone present, real, and that, for her, was completely new. She began to participate in local activities, to open up spaces within the property, to let other women, many in situations similar to the one she had experienced, find a place of calm there. It wasn't a formal project at first. It was something organic, almost inevitable, as if everything that had happened had prepared her precisely for that. And without realizing it, Elena went from being an invisible figure to becoming someone essential in that environment. Months later, a final surprise brought everything full circle. Reviewing one of the files she hadn't yet fully explored, she found an extension of the plan Arturo had left behind. It wasn't just financial protection. There was a second, more discreet structure designed to sustain whatever she chose to build there in the long term. It wasn't conditional, it had no restrictions. It was simply a solid foundation for whatever path she chose. Elena stared at those documents for a long time, feeling neither anger nor guilt, only a profound understanding of something that had taken far too long to arrive. Arturo hadn't been the man she needed in life, but in some imperfect way, he had been the man who gave her the freedom she never had. Today, Elena Valdez no longer measures her life by what she lost or what was denied her. She measures it by what she was finally able to build from within herself. The house still stands, the garden continues to grow, and the doors remain open to those who arrive seeking something they sometimes can't even name. She no longer waits for recognition, validation, or belated promises. She learned too late, but just in time, that the value of a life lies not in what others decide to give you, but in what you are capable of sustaining when everything else disappears. And if anything is clear when looking at her entire story, it is that she was not a discarded woman. She was a woman who, after 40 years, finally stopped living for others and began at last to truly live.